How would you react if a 12-year-old boy dressed in sweatshirt and brown pants claimed he could make your child walk again? And he actually did. It was a cold Friday morning in New York when Greg pulled into the car wash just outside the city limits, unaware of what was about to unfold. The sky was the color of slate, and a thin sheet of frost clung stubbornly to the windshield wipers. He rubbed his hands together for warmth, then turned off the ignition with a heavy sigh. In the back seat, his 10-year-old daughter, Kate, sat motionless, bundled in a pink jacket, her legs curled beneath a wool blanket. Her face was pale, her eyes dull, as if even her gaze had lost its will to move. Greg got out slowly, stretched his legs, and walked around to open the rear door. With practiced care, he lifted Kate from her seat, cradling her as he had done every day since the accident. A wheelchair waited in the trunk. He gently placed her into it, adjusted her hat, and tucked the blanket tighter around her legs. That's when he saw him. A boy, no older than 12, was crouched by a row of soap buckets, scrubbing the floor of the lot with a ragged towel. His frame was thin, his sneakers worn, and his sweatshirt 2 sizes too big. His hair stuck out from under a beanie, and his hands were red from cold and detergent. Yet there was something in his eyes, alert, watchful, older than his years. He noticed Kate the moment she was lowered into the wheelchair. He stood up straight, wiping his hands on his pants, then walked over. Greg didn't expect anyone to speak. Most people didn't. They glanced at Kate and quickly looked away. But this boy walked right up and said, calmly, confidently, "Sir, I can make your daughter walk again." Greg froze. At first, he thought he misheard. The boy stood with quiet certainty, hands at his sides, gaze steady. "Excuse me," Greg said, blinking. "I can help her walk again," the boy repeated, softer now, but just as sure. Greg stared at him, blinking in disbelief. His voice rose with irritation. "Kid, you're just a cleaner and a beggar. You shouldn't be saying things like that." The boy didn't flinch. "I'm a doctor." Greg laughed, a dry, exhausted sound. "What did you say?" "I'm a doctor," the boy said again, this time with a trace of pride. "I learned from my dad. He was a bone healer. Before he passed, he taught me everything he knew." Greg looked around, expecting someone to step in, maybe a manager to call the kid off. But no one came. The lot was quiet, and the world felt still. "Listen, I don't know what kind of joke this is, but my daughter has spinal trauma. Doctors, real doctors, told us she'd never walk again." "Sometimes doctors forget," the boy said gently. "But the body remembers." Kate, who had been silent the whole time, turned her head slightly toward the boy. Her voice was barely a whisper. "What's your name?" He smiled. "Lucas." "I'm Kate." Greg sighed. "Look, Lucas, I appreciate whatever you're trying to do, but this isn't something you can just fix." Lucas nodded. "I understand. But maybe we can try. I don't want money. I don't want anything. Just give me a little time. If it doesn't work, I'll never bother you again." Greg looked down at his daughter. Her eyes, so often dull and distant, were locked onto Lucas now with something that looked dangerously close to hope. "Why do you want to help?" Greg asked. Lucas looked away, then back. "Because no one helped me. My mom died when I was born. My dad passed last year. I don't go to school. I work here for food. But what he taught me, that helps people. And your daughter, she shouldn't be stuck like this." Greg hesitated, torn between skepticism and something deeper, something instinctive. He wanted to protect Kate from false hope. But he also saw something in Lucas, not desperation, not madness, but belief. That rare kind that doesn't shout but still fills a room. Finally, Greg exhaled. "If we do this, where?" "The city garden," Lucas said. "It's quiet, and she'll feel safe there. Tomorrow morning. Bring a bomb, a thermos of warm water, and crutches if you have them." Greg didn't respond immediately. He looked at Kate. Her fingers clutched the side of the wheelchair. She nodded slightly. "Okay," Greg said. "We'll be there." Lucas smiled, a real one this time, and backed away without another word. He returned to the soap buckets, to his scrubbing, like nothing had happened. But everything had. Greg wheeled his daughter toward the waiting area, unsure of what tomorrow would bring. Yet for the first time in a long while, the cold air didn't bite quite as hard. And for the first time in weeks, Kate was humming softly, the faintest tune. Like a forgotten melody finally finding its way back. It was already past 6 p.m. when Greg found himself seated at the kitchen table, his hands cradling a lukewarm cup of coffee that had long gone bitter, but he didn't drink it. He only stared into it, as though answers might rise to the surface. He couldn't shake the image of that boy, no more than 12, with a rag in his hand and a voice that didn't waver, saying, "Sir, I can make your daughter walk again." The world hadn't stopped spinning. The city hadn't fallen silent. And yet something about that moment had lodged itself deep inside Greg's chest like a seed he hadn't asked for, but now couldn't ignore. He wasn't the sort of man to believe in miracles, and after months of therapy appointments, medical bills, and sleepless nights pushing a wheelchair through tight hallways, he had grown skeptical of promises. But this boy, Lucas, hadn't made a promise. He'd made a statement, and what unnerved Greg wasn't how impossible it sounded, but how much it hadn't felt like a lie. Later that night, while Kate slept and the house was quiet, Greg found himself getting into his truck again, not sure where he was going until the familiar fluorescent lights of the car wash came into view. He half expected Lucas to be gone, but there he was, hunched over a mop bucket, still working as if nothing had changed. Greg stepped out, his breath clouding slightly in the cold, and called out, "Lucas." The boy straightened slowly, as if he'd been expecting this moment, and wiped his hands on the legs of his jeans. Greg walked up to him and said, "I don't know what made me come back, but if you're serious about what you said, if you really think you can help, then let's try it." Lucas didn't smile or jump in excitement. He just nodded with a calmness far too grown for his age and replied, "We'll meet in the city garden every morning. We won't rush it. The body moves when the mind starts to believe." Greg was taken aback by the clarity of the instructions, but something in the boy's voice made him trust every word. The next morning came faster than expected. The sun hadn't yet broken the horizon when Greg backed out of the driveway with Kate bundled in the back seat, still groggy, wrapped in her pink jacket with her favorite stuffed elephant tucked under one arm. A silver thermos steamed faintly beside the gear shift. The cocoa-scented balm Lucas had asked for was zipped inside his coat pocket, and the crutches, still dusty from the hospital closet, lay in the trunk. Kate didn't ask questions. She only watched him quietly, as if she, too, felt something was different about this day. When they arrived at the city garden, the place was nearly empty except for a few joggers and a groundskeeper blowing leaves from the walking path. Under the largest oak tree near the stone benches sat Lucas, already there, legs crossed on a neatly laid towel, a drawstring pouch open beside him containing a collection of cloths, tiny jars, and what looked like dried herbs. He looked up and nodded as Greg wheeled Kate closer, then stood and walked over, motioning gently toward the towel. Kate looked hesitant, unsure of what this would feel like or why she was even there. But something about Lucas's voice made her nod in agreement, and Greg helped lower her down gently, setting the crutches aside. Lucas took his time preparing. He poured a little warm water into a shallow bowl, dipped one of the cloths into it, and wrung it out slowly, then uncapped the balm and warmed it between his palms before applying it to Kate's knees with soft, circular motions. He didn't speak about her injury or ask her to move or try anything strenuous. Instead, he said, "Do you like cartoons?" Kate blinked, startled by the question, and then replied softly, "Yeah." Lucas smiled and said, "Which ones?" She thought for a second before whispering, "Adventure Club, the one with the flying boat." Lucas grinned. "That's a good one. I always wanted a flying boat, not for adventures, just so I could nap in the clouds." Greg stood off to the side, arms folded, watching them closely, waiting for something unusual or out of place. But all he saw was a boy carefully moving his hands with care and intention while talking about childhood dreams and silly characters. Lucas alternated between warming her legs with the soaked cloth and gently massaging her joints with the balm, never rushing, never forcing anything. The session lasted about 30 minutes, and the entire time, he kept Kate talking, not about doctors or healing, but about her favorite colors, her favorite snacks, and what kind of dog she wanted if they ever moved to a bigger house. Greg realized he hadn't heard his daughter speak that much since before the accident. When Lucas finally wiped her knees clean and helped Greg lift her back into the wheelchair, Kate's cheeks were a little pinker than before, her expression slightly brighter. "Same time tomorrow?" Lucas asked, standing next to his towel. Greg nodded, still unsure of what he was agreeing to, but knowing he'd return. Kate looked back at the oak tree as they wheeled away, and for the first time in weeks, Greg caught her humming quietly under her breath, That afternoon, Greg sat down at his desk with a legal pad and wrote at the top, Day 1. He didn't know why he was recording it, or for who, but it felt right. Beneath it, he scribbled, She smiled and laughed. More than she has in weeks. The next morning was colder. Greg wore 2 layers, but Lucas still sat under that tree, towel spread out, hands ready, the pouch of healing tools beside him. Kate was more curious now, asking him what each herb did, why the cloth smelled a certain way, and whether the water made a difference. Lucas answered every question with quiet confidence. This herb helps relax the nerves, he explained. This balm keeps the skin soft, but it's really the pressure that reminds the muscles they're still wanted. The warm water tells the body it's safe. Greg listened as he paced slowly nearby. No one had ever explained anything like that. Doctors used words he didn't understand. Therapists spoke in goals and metrics, but Lucas talked like everything was simple, as if healing had more to do with being seen than being diagnosed. By the 3rd session, Kate was more comfortable, joking with Lucas about cartoons and asking if he'd ever eaten pickles with peanut butter. Lucas said he had once, out of curiosity, and hated it. Greg brought him a sandwich the next day, wrapped in foil and tucked inside a brown paper bag. He didn't mention it, and neither did Lucas, but the bag was gone by the time the session ended. Each day, Lucas performed the same routine, massaging gently, alternating heat and pressure, speaking to Kate with genuine interest, while Greg remained nearby, growing more silent each day, not out of suspicion anymore, but out of awe. He couldn't explain it, and he didn't try to. What mattered was that Kate, his daughter who had once stared blankly through windows and cried herself to sleep, was now laughing in the morning, asking when they were leaving, and looking forward to seeing someone. On the 5th morning, she didn't need help lowering herself onto the towel. Greg still supported her, but her hands moved with more certainty. Lucas didn't point it out. He just nodded slightly and began the massage. That day, when the session was done, Kate said, Can we bring him hot chocolate tomorrow? Greg said yes before she even finished the question. And when they drove home, her hand rested on the window, fingers tapping lightly to a song she was humming again. Greg sat that evening, writing in his notepad, Day 5. She asked to give back. That's how I know something's working. 2 weeks had passed since that first morning under the oak tree. Every day, Greg drove Kate to the city garden before the sun was fully up. Every day, Lucas was there waiting, towel spread neatly, hands ready, eyes calm. The routine had become familiar, almost sacred in its rhythm. Kate would settle onto the towel, Lucas would prepare the warm compress, apply the balm, and start gently working through the same massage and motion patterns. They would talk. Sometimes they would laugh. But slowly, quietly, something had shifted. Greg felt it first. It was subtle at first, like a change in temperature that you don't feel until the wind hits you just right. Kate, who had started the sessions with nervous curiosity, was growing quieter again. Her giggles had become rare. Her questions had thinned out. And most importantly, there was still no movement. No twitch. No pressure. No sign. Her legs remained limp, motionless, as if frozen in time. Greg watched her smile fade a little more with each passing day, and though Lucas remained steady, never discouraged, Greg felt the weight of hope turning sour in his chest. On the 14th day, as Lucas rubbed the balm gently into Kate's knees, she whispered, Maybe it's just not going to happen. Her voice wasn't angry or upset. It was resigned, hollow, like the last candle burning out. Greg heard it, and it broke something inside him. He had spent so long protecting her from disappointment. Now he had led her directly into it. That evening, while Kate was in the car finishing a juice box and staring quietly out the window, Greg approached Lucas under the tree, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. Lucas was wiping his hands clean with a cloth, the small pouch of supplies nearly empty after 2 weeks of use. Greg didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Why are you doing this? He asked, quietly but firmly. Really, I want to know. This isn't normal. You're not just some curious kid, Lucas. You show up every morning. You do this work like you were born to do it. But you don't want money. You don't ask for anything. So what? Lucas paused for a long time. Then he sat down on the towel, pulling his legs up to his chest like it was the only safe way to speak. I know what it feels like to have no one, he said. Greg didn't move. Lucas continued, his voice steady but softer now. My mom died when I was born. I never knew her. Just a photo. My dad was all I had. He wasn't a doctor. Not the kind with a degree, but people came to him when doctors gave up. He worked with his hands, he used herbs, heat, oils. He used time. And most of all, he listened. He told me once, sometimes what people really need is someone to believe they're not broken. I used to watch him with veterans, street kids, old women who couldn't afford a hospital. I carried his bag. I boiled his water. When he got sick, he tried to teach me everything he could. Said I'd need it. Greg listened, arms still crossed, but his breathing slowed. When he died last winter, I didn't know where to go. So I just started showing up at places where people looked like they'd forgotten how to hope. Like that car wash. Like your daughter, Lucas added. I don't know everything. I mess up, but I know how to give what he gave. And if I can help even one person feel like they're worth fighting for again, then I don't need anything else. Greg looked down at his shoes, struggling to speak. He wanted to say thank you. He wanted to say sorry. He wanted to say 1,000 things, but none of them felt right. All he managed was, you don't even know her. Lucas shrugged. I didn't know my dad either, not really. But I still loved him. Greg walked away after that, not out of anger, but out of something heavier, confusion. Not about Lucas, not anymore, but about himself. About the walls he had built. About the people he had stopped trusting. About the boy who had every reason to quit, and yet showed up every day just to help someone else. That night, Greg sat on the porch with a notebook in his lap. The sky above was bruised with stars, and Kate was asleep inside. He opened to a blank page and wrote slowly, Day 14. I don't know what's happening anymore. But for the first time, I think I'm the one learning something. The next morning, he still drove to the garden. Lucas was already waiting. And Kate, though quiet, didn't protest. Because even when hope feels silent, some part of us still shows up, just in case today is the day everything changes. It was Monday morning, the beginning of the third week. The city garden had started to thaw from the lingering grip of late winter. Patches of green peeked through the frost-dusted grass, and the air, though still brisk, no longer bit with the same sharpness. Greg pulled into the familiar parking space beneath the old maple tree, the same spot he'd chosen every morning since Lucas had come into their lives. As usual, the thermos of warm water rested in the console, and the bomb was zipped into his coat pocket. The crutches lay in the trunk, untouched, but never forgotten. Kate sat beside him in the back seat, her face more alert than it had been 2 weeks ago, though her silence had returned. Not the hopeless kind from before, but the kind that came with deep focus. She looked out at the empty stretch of the park, watching for that figure she knew would already be there. Sure enough, Lucas sat beneath the oak tree, cross-legged, his towel laid out like a sacred place of ritual, his little pouch of tools lined up neatly on its edge. When he saw them approaching, he stood and gave Kate a small wave. Not a grand gesture, just enough to acknowledge her presence without making it a performance. That was what made Lucas different. He never made her feel watched, just seen. Greg helped Kate out of the car and into her chair. As he wheeled her toward the tree, he sensed something different in the air, not just the warmer wind, but something quieter, calmer, a kind of peace that hadn't been there before. Lucas didn't speak much that morning. He simply helped Greg lift Kate onto the towel, unzip the pouch, and poured warm water into the shallow bowl. The steam curled softly into the morning air. He dipped the cloth, wrung it with care, and placed it gently over her knees as he'd done every day before. But today was not like every day before. Kate flinched. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but both Greg and Lucas saw it. Her legs shifted, not dramatically, but deliberately, as though startled by the temperature. Lucas froze, watching her face. You felt that, didn't you? He asked, voice low. Kate blinked and slowly nodded. Her eyes were wide, startled but not frightened. Lucas exhaled with the faintest smile, not of triumph, but of understanding. He didn't celebrate. He didn't call attention to it. He simply continued, applying balm to her knees with gentler care than ever before, massaging the muscles and rotating her joints slowly, thoughtfully. He kept her talking, but even his words were softer, more personal. Greg, seated on the bench a few feet away, leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. He didn't want to interrupt. He didn't want to ask what it meant. He just watched as his daughter's face changed. It was no longer the expression of someone enduring something. It was the look of someone participating in their own restoration. When the session ended, Kate was quiet, but there was a lightness in her voice when she said, "See you tomorrow, Lucas." Her smile was shy, not forced. Greg didn't say anything as he wheeled her back to the car. He didn't need to. The change was written in the way she sat up straighter, how she didn't look away when people passed them on the sidewalk. That night, after dinner, the air inside their small living room was unusually still. Greg sat on the edge of the couch, flipping aimlessly through a magazine, when he heard her voice behind him. "Dad." He turned. Kate sat in her chair at the edge of the hallway, her stuffed elephant resting in her lap. Her hands were gripping the arms of her wheelchair more tightly than usual. "What's up, sweetheart?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she bit her lip and stared at her legs. "Can we try?" she finally whispered. "Just to see." Greg blinked. "Try." She nodded. "To stand." His heart leapt and dropped at the same time. He stood up slowly, afraid that if he moved too quickly, he might scare the moment away. "Are you sure?" he asked. Kate nodded again, her eyes locked on his. He walked over, knelt beside her, and wrapped his arms gently around her waist. Her hands gripped his shoulders. Together, they counted to 3. 1, 2, 3. Greg lifted carefully, supporting most of her weight. Her feet touched the floor, and he could feel a faint tremble in her knees. Not from pain, but from effort. She didn't rise far, not even enough to fully straighten, but she rose. Her legs held something, even if only for seconds. And then she sat back down, breathless, cheeks flushed, eyes shining. Greg crouched in front of her, his voice caught in his throat. "You did it," he said. "Not really," she replied. "No," he said gently, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "You did." She looked down at her legs, then back up at him with a smile more radiant than any he'd seen since the accident. "I think I believe it now," she whispered. Greg tucked her stuffed elephant beside her and stood, wiping his eyes before she could see. He turned away under the pretense of going to the kitchen but paused at the doorway, staring at nothing. For the first time since their world had turned upside down, the word maybe wasn't terrifying. It was hopeful. The next morning, Greg packed everything faster than usual. The bomb, the warm water, the crutches. Not because he was convinced the miracle had arrived, but because he had seen something stronger than a miracle. He had seen his daughter believe. And that belief, fragile and growing, was the first real shift in all their lives. They drove back to the garden. Lucas was already waiting. And this time, Greg brought something else, not just tools and supplies, but a glimmer of faith. Faith in a 12-year-old boy who had nothing and gave everything, and in a little girl who had decided, finally, to try. The 4th week arrived with a sky that was wide and open, the early sunlight pouring like honey across the stone paths of the city garden. There was something softer in the air, like the world was holding its breath for something new. Greg parked the car in the usual spot, but this time, he didn't move right away. He glanced at Kate in the rearview mirror. Her hands were folded in her lap, her gaze fixed forward. She hadn't spoken much during the ride, but she hadn't seemed afraid either. There was a quiet determination in her. In the trunk lay the crutches. They had sat untouched for weeks, always packed but never used, waiting like silent witnesses to a future no one had dared believe in. But today, they were going to try. When they reached the garden, Lucas was already there as always, kneeling on the towel, warming the bomb between his palms. The pouch of herbs lay open, and the warm water steamed gently in its bowl. He stood as they approached and gave Kate a reassuring smile. "Morning," he said. "Hi," Kate replied softly. Greg knelt down, opened the trunk, and pulled out the crutches. He held them for a moment, almost reverently, before setting them on the bench beside Lucas's supplies. Kate stared at them, her expression a mixture of wonder and fear. "You ready?" Lucas asked gently. Kate hesitated, her fingers tightening on the armrest of the wheelchair. "What if I fall?" she whispered. "Then we try again," Lucas said simply. There was no pep talk, no false promises, just that unwavering calm that had become Lucas's gift. He stepped forward, helped Kate onto the towel, and began the usual routine. He applied the bomb slowly, massaging her knees, ankles, and calves with deliberate, tender pressure. He soaked the cloth in warm water and wrapped it around her legs, then asked her to close her eyes and breathe with him. After 20 minutes of stretching and focused pressure, he looked at Greg and gave a subtle nod. Greg moved closer, picking up the crutches and placing them beside Kate. She looked at them as if they were alive, like they might either betray or deliver her. Lucas stood behind her and placed his hands gently under her arms. Just lean on us, he said. You're not alone. Greg stood on her left, steadying her shoulder, his grip firm and warm. With one deep breath, Kate pushed up from the ground. The movement was slow, achingly slow, but her legs responded. Not fully, not strongly, but enough. Enough for her to straighten. Enough to bear part of her own weight. Lucas guided the crutches under her arms, adjusting them with care, watching her face for any sign of distress. You okay? He asked. Kate didn't speak. She nodded. Let's try one step, Lucas said. Greg watched, hardly daring to breathe. Kate looked down at her feet, willed them to move, and shifted her right foot forward by maybe 3 inches. The crutch moved next, then her left foot, shaking slightly. 1, then another, 2, then 3. She stopped. Her legs trembled, and her breath came fast, but she was still upright. 3 steps. And then she laughed. It wasn't a loud laugh. It wasn't a long one. But it was pure and full of something that had been missing for far too long: victory. Lucas smiled. Greg wiped his eyes and pretended it was the wind. From that day on, every session began the same: warm balm, gentle massage, warm water, but it ended with steps. Small ones. Shaky ones. But real steps, counted and celebrated, not in cheers but in shared silence and smiles. Kate pushed herself more with each passing day. She went from 3 steps to 5, then to 7. She began asking to try again even when her legs were tired. Lucas never pressured her. He only asked, "Are you ready?" And when she nodded, he stood behind her with the same patience he always had. Greg began bringing snacks, at first just a sandwich or a granola bar stuffed into a paper towel, but then a thermos of hot tea, a warm bag of breakfast rolls. Lucas never asked for them. He only accepted them with a nod and a thank you. They talked more now, Greg and Lucas. After Kate's sessions, while she rested or played with a twig she'd turned into a magic wand, Greg would sit beside Lucas and ask questions. You live behind the car wash? He asked one morning. Lucas nodded. The storage room. It's not heated, but I found a thick blanket. It's enough. What about food? Sometimes I help the guy who runs the taco truck nearby. He gives me leftovers if I clean the griddle. Greg was silent for a while. You ever think about going back to school? Lucas shrugged. I used to. But this, he gestured to Kate, now counting her steps aloud. This feels more important right now. Greg didn't know what to say. He looked at the boy, his ragged sneakers, his mismatched gloves, the pouch he kept so meticulously ordered, and realized something that made his chest ache. Lucas had every reason to give up. No parents, no stability, no help. But instead, he showed up. Every day. No complaints. No conditions. That kind of devotion changed something in Greg. It chipped away at the hard shell he had built over years of disappointment. It reached a place he didn't even know had gone cold. He found himself wanting to protect Lucas, to offer more than snacks or silence. He found himself caring. By the end of the week, Kate had taken 11 steps. Each one was still slow, still trembling, but every single one mattered. And none of it would have happened without a boy who had nothing to give except the most powerful thing in the world: belief. It happened on a Thursday morning, the kind of morning where the clouds pressed low against the rooftops and the air carried that strange, heavy stillness that always came just before a storm. The city garden felt quieter than usual. The breeze was cool but not cold, and the leaves on the trees barely stirred. It was the kind of day where people hurried indoors, expecting rain at any moment, but Greg Reeves wasn't rushing. He stood beside his car with the trunk open, retrieving the familiar pair of crutches and the now routine items: balm, thermos, towel. It had become a rhythm, this new life. Not easy, but steady. And in the last few weeks, steady had started to feel like a blessing. Kate sat in the back seat, already bundled up, already awake, her eyes alert with something Greg hadn't seen in a long time: readiness. She didn't wait for her father to coax her out of her seat. She unbuckled herself and smiled the moment their eyes met. "Let's go," she said, and he could hear the eagerness tucked between her words. When they arrived at the usual clearing beneath the oak tree, Lucas was already there, kneeling beside the laid-out towel, pouch open, everything arranged just as it always was. There was a consistency in him that Greg had come to respect deeply, a quiet kind of devotion that never needed applause. He didn't smile broadly or speak loudly. He just nodded as they approached, stood up, and met Kate's eyes. "Ready?" he asked. Kate gave a confident nod and replied, more than ever. There was no sign. No spark or thunder or dramatic swell of music. There was only the soft crunch of grass beneath her feet as Greg and Lucas helped her onto the towel. Lucas began as he always did, warming the balm between his palms, working it gently into her legs, applying warm compresses in long, patient motions. They spoke a little. Kate mentioned a dream she'd had about flying, and Lucas told her about a raccoon that had tried to steal his food the night before. But there was a focus in all three of them today, something electric but unspoken. After the preparation was done, Lucas handed Greg the pouch and stood directly in front of Kate. She pulled herself upright with the help of the crutches, her arms trembling just slightly. Greg moved instinctively to support her, but Lucas held up a hand, not to stop him, but to pause the moment. Let's try something different, Lucas said softly. He stepped behind her, not touching, just watching. I want you to try on your own. Just one breath. 1 second. Kate looked unsure, but then she inhaled slowly. Her fingers gripped the crutches. Greg watched from the side, heart pounding, unsure whether to move or speak or pray. Lucas nodded once. I'm letting go now. And he did. Greg didn't realize what was happening at first. It was so subtle. Lucas's hands dropped, but Kate didn't. She didn't fall. She didn't wobble. She stood, on her own, and then stepped, 1 foot forward, then another, and another. For steps. For whole, deliberate steps, guided not by hands or braces, but by Kate's own will. Greg's breath caught in his chest. He took a half step forward, stunned. She's walking, he whispered. Kate turned toward him, her cheeks flushed, her eyes wide and glowing. She wasn't breathing heavily, she was beaming. There was something radiating from her, something that hadn't been there in months. Something like joy. Something like freedom. Lucas didn't move. He stood a few feet behind her, arms folded softly, his expression calm. He didn't cheer. He didn't jump or clap. He just watched with the quiet satisfaction of someone who knew this moment had been waiting all along. Greg fell to his knees beside his daughter, his hands shaking as he reached out to steady her, not because she was falling, but because he couldn't believe it. You did it, he whispered. Kate looked at him, then turned her gaze to Lucas and said, We did it. Greg couldn't stop the tears now. He laughed through them, wiping at his face like a man seeing light after too much darkness. Later that afternoon, back at home, Greg sat at the kitchen table with a wad of cash folded tightly in his hand. He waited by the door for Lucas, who had agreed, reluctantly, to come by after the session. When he arrived, still in the same hoodie, still looking like a kid far too small for the weight he carried, Greg stood up immediately. I need you to take this, Greg said, extending the money. For everything. For the hours. For the mornings. He paused, voice catching, for giving me my daughter back. Lucas looked at the bills, but he didn't reach out. I can't take that, he said gently. Greg frowned. Why not? Lucas shrugged slightly. Because your daughter believed in herself. That's the only payment I need. Greg stood frozen. There were 1,000 reasons he wanted to argue, 1,000 ways he wanted to insist, but none of them felt right. He saw the truth in Lucas's eyes, saw the kind of honor that couldn't be taught, only passed down through love and loss. You're something else, Greg finally said. Lucas just smiled. She is too. And with that, he turned and walked back down the street, hands in his pockets, put up against the drizzle that had just started to fall, disappearing into the gray like a boy with nothing to prove and everything to give. Greg stood at the doorway for a long time, the bills still in his hand, the sound of his daughter laughing in the living room echoing behind him. The miracle hadn't come from a hospital or a specialist or a lab. It had come from a boy with worn shoes, steady hands, and a heart full of faith. And that miracle had just taken 4 perfect steps. The breeze that Saturday morning was light and warm, brushing gently through the city as Greg turned into the old car wash with a quiet sense of purpose. It had been weeks since Kate last needed her crutches. She now walked slowly but confidently, her arms swinging freely by her sides, her gait not perfect but undeniably her own. Each step she took was a quiet miracle, one that still made Greg catch his breath when he watched her cross a room. And though the world had returned to its usual rhythm, school, groceries, errands, something inside their lives had shifted forever. Greg had come back to the place where it all started, the place where a 12-year-old boy with worn shoes and calm eyes had said 6 impossible words. Sir, I can make her walk. Kate sat beside him in the passenger seat, hands folded around a small white gift bag. Inside it was a brand new coat, thick, clean, and warm, and a sturdy pair of shoes, not too flashy, just strong and dependable, like Lucas. She had picked them out herself. When they stepped out of the car and approached the wash bay, Greg immediately noticed something was off. Lucas wasn't there. A tall man stood inside, washing down a panel of drying cloths. Greg asked, "Is Lucas around?" The man shook his head. "Haven't seen him in days. Kid just stopped coming one afternoon. Didn't say why." Greg felt something tighten in his chest. He left the note anyway, tucked under a brick near the back wall. "Thank you for everything. You changed our lives." He placed the gift beside it, hoping that somehow, someday, Lucas would find them. And then the seasons turned. Spring melted into summer, and Kate's steps became stronger. She began running short sprints on soft grass. She climbed stairs without help, and every night, before bed, she whispered a quiet thank you, not to Greg, not to herself, but to the boy who had asked for nothing and given her everything. It was on a golden July morning that Greg and Kate returned to the garden. They hadn't planned to. It was a spontaneous drive, one of those mornings when nostalgia and hope mixed together in the wind. When they arrived, the tree was still there, unchanged, patient, silent. But this time, someone was under it. Lucas sat cross-legged in the grass, a small notebook in his lap, scribbling with a pencil, his face calm and focused. He looked older somehow, like time had passed through him differently. Kate saw him first. She didn't hesitate. She didn't wait. She broke into a run, still a little uneven, still not fast, but full of joy and fire. She reached him, threw her arms around his neck, and exclaimed, "I did it." Lucas looked up, smiled softly, and said, "I knew you would." Greg stood a few paces behind, heart full. He walked over, sat down beside the boy, and watched his daughter twirl in the sunlight. "You changed our lives, kid," Greg said quietly. Lucas nodded once. He didn't speak, but he didn't have to. His silence held the kind of peace that only comes from purpose fulfilled. The world didn't erupt in cheers. There was no headline, no spotlight. Just a girl walking, a father watching, and a boy with nothing left but his will to give. Sometimes healing doesn't come from machines or medicine. Sometimes it comes from love, patience, and the hands of a child who never gave up. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more heart-touching stories like this. What are your thoughts on the journey of Greg, Kate, and Lucas? Did the ending leave a lasting impression on you? Share what you feel about the story and how it all ended in the comments below. We'd truly love to know. Also, rate this story on a scale of 1 to 10. Was it moving enough to earn a full 10 from you? And let us know, are you watching from the UK, or the USA, or any part of the world? Drop your location in the comments. Thanks for being a part of this journey. See you in the next story.